Shalom. I'm Messianic Rabbi Eric Walker, and welcome to this edition of Revealing Prophecy. Each week we connect the dots of the news from around the world with biblical prophecy and talk about what was, what is, and what is to come. The monologue is our original work, and all other articles are used giving credit to their respective sources. We invite you to visit ignitingnation.com for a full roster of our daily interviews, and we also encourage you to sign up for our newsletter and our YouTube channel so you never have to miss out on any special offers and events. Here's a quick look at what we will be covering on today's show. I'll be opening with a monologue. We'll be doing a story on a note on last Tuesday's elections in Israel. A story on in face of growing Iran threat, debate resurfaces over U.S.-Israel Mutual Defense Pact. We'll also be discussing U.S. sanctions, Central Bank of Iran going after suspected funding linked to terror groups. And our final story is Turkey seeks to go nuclear, another trigger for Ezekiel 38. Before we get into this, I always like to establish the foundation of our belief system, and that is the inherent and infallible Word of the Bible. The Bible itself contains approximately 2,500 prophecies, of which around 2,000 have already been fulfilled. Given that the Bible proves so reliable a document, there is every reason to expect that the remaining 500 prophecies, those slated for the time of the end, also will be fulfilled to the last letter. Who can afford to ignore these coming events, much less miss out on the immeasurable blessings offered to anyone and everyone who submits to the control of the Bible's author, God Himself? Would a reasonable person take lightly God's warning of judgment for those who reject what they know to be true about Jesus and the Bible, or who reject Jesus' claims on their lives? And now for my monologue. I think it's time that I make it very clear that not everything that happens in the Middle East is an end-time sign. There, I said it. Yes, there was a bombing of oil production facilities in Saudi Arabia, and there is every indication that it was at the hands of Iran. However, Saudi Arabia has not made an official statement saying that they have irrefutable evidence that Iran was behind the attack. There are those that are saying it could have possibly been an attack from Houthi rebels in Yemen. And until the leadership of Saudi Arabia makes a clear statement, then no formal declaration of responsibility or the inevitable follow-on declaration of war will be issued. So Iran just gets a free pass and Saudi Arabia is too chicken to use the evidence they have to clearly indict Iran? This is the perfect scenario to describe why North America needs to read the prophecies of Scripture. Let's say Saudi Arabia publicly blames Iran and does nothing so as to avoid an all-out war. The logic and reasoning of the Shiite mind would say it is open season on Saudi oil fields, so let's bomb them again until we break the back of the great Satan America, who is levying heavy financial sanctions on Iran. If there's an actual declaration of war, what is our role here in the United States? Instead, Israel, along with Saudi Arabia, used its air power to destroy Iranian installations in Syria near the Iraqi-Syrian border, where additional bombs were being prepared for more strikes on Saudi Arabian oil fields. If there were a formal declaration of responsibility, there will also have to be a declaration of war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. This would then create a diplomatic and military alignment in the Middle East where clear lines would have to be drawn as to whose side each country would be on. While Saudi Arabia withholds formal accusations, Shiite strongholds in Iraq on the Syrian border are being pummeled, rendering the same effect as attacking the Shiite nation of Iran. In fact, under the cover of counterterrorism, alliances are being formed that are accomplishing the same results of protecting Israel without formally joining into a regional Middle East war. Is this a precursor or a glimpse into what is to come? Well, without question. The stage is being set in Iran under the most vile agenda for the annihilation of Israel. The United States and the Sunni side of Islam is using its proxies and dwindling influence over the region to impact the world's economy until the U.S. releases its ever stronger sanctions against this agenda of hate. Iran failed to stop tankers in the Straits of Hormuz and has now resorted to military attacks on Saudi Arabia. We have seen the increase in military activity by Iran through its proxy Hezbollah, but this has only caused Israel and the United States to prepare for an all-out war and subsequent victory in Lebanon and the Golan Heights. If this should take place, Syria and the Isaiah 17 prophecy will come to fruition in our day, and the prophecy against Elam in Jeremiah impacting western Iran will also come into alignment. The recent elections in Israel does not destabilize Israel. The Knesset is the legislative branch of the government and means no new laws will be passed until a new Congress, if you will, has been seated. Netanyahu remains Prime Minister and Minister of Defense until he isn't, and a new coalition government has been formed. The West is woefully unaware of the alignment taking place in the Middle East. If the Bible were to be placed in only one category, it would be placed in the prophecy section of any bookstore. Yet this is the most omitted topic within the Western Church today. Your very hope for the Messiah returning is based on prophecy. Your salvation is based on prophecy. What happens to people and nations that stand for and against Israel has been determined, and over the course of 5,000 years has come to pass exactly as it was prophesied. Wake up, sleepy church. Open your eyes and stop looking at what your friend had to eat last night and keep your eyes glued on Israel in the Middle East. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. The peace of Jerusalem is a someone, not a something. It is Jesus, Yeshua, Messiah, the Anointed One, Son of David, who will come when the Middle East alignment is just like the prophets foretold at the instruction of God. It is not your pastor's responsibility or mine or the guests on our shows who have written great books about the prophetic nature of God's Word. It is your responsibility to study the Word to show yourself approved of God. He gave us His Word, and not one word of it has been added to in 2,000 years. It does not change, and it will not change, and what it says will come to pass just as it says. These are the days he was talking about when he told us Ishmael would be a wild donkey of a man, and all the nations of the world would war against him, and he would live in hostility with his brothers. You are living in the most exciting prophetic times since Jesus walked this earth, and the West is absolutely clueless except for a small minority that even read their Bibles. The winds of change are blowing, and riding on the wind is a new message. From Isaiah 43:15-21, the Lord says, I am the Lord, your Holy One, the Creator of Israel, your King. Thus says the Lord, who makes a way in the sea and a path through the mighty waters, who brings forth the chariot and horse, the army and the power. They shall lie down together, they shall not rise, they are extinguished, they are quenched like a wick. Verse 18, do not remember the former things, nor consider the things of old. Behold, I will do a new thing. Now it shall spring forth. Shall you not know it? I will even make a road in the wilderness and rivers in the desert. The beasts of the field will honor me, the jackals and the ostriches, because I give waters in the wilderness and rivers in the desert, to give drink to my people, my chosen. This people I have formed for myself, they shall declare my praise. We walk by faith and not by sight, and believe in the sovereignty of God. Fear not, for He is God. As we prepare for the new year, 5,780, to arrive at sundown on Sunday, September 29th, as we usher in the Feast of Trumpets from Leviticus 23, we here at Igniting Nation Ministries wish you and your family a happy, healthy, and sweet new year. And thank you for your continued support of Igniting a Nation Ministries. And that, my friends, concludes today's monologue. Let us now dig in to this week's stories. Our first story, a note on Tuesday's elections, contributed by Carolyn Glick. The U.S. media coverage of the Israeli elections has misrepresented the results of Tuesday's vote. This isn't necessarily deliberate. Israeli elections are inscrutable for most foreigners, particularly for Americans who are used to the clarity of the presidential system and the two-party system. Here are a few of the basic facts about how the vote has gone and where Israel is likely to go in the days and weeks ahead. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu did not lose, and his challenger, former IDF Chief of General Staff and Blue and White faction Chief Benny Gantz, did not win. Despite the fact that Blue and White won 33 seats, now been changed according to the reports that came out today, despite the report of Carolyn Glick that Blue and White won 33 seats in the 120-seat Knesset to Likud's 31 seats, Gantz cannot form a government under any circumstance. He cannot build a majority coalition. Wednesday, Netanyahu assembled the heads of all the right-wing and religious parties that form the basis for the Likud-led governing coalitions. The factions unified into one right-wing bloc and agreed on principles for future coalition talks. They agreed to conduct coalition talks as a bloc under Netanyahu's leadership. By forming this 55-member bloc, Netanyahu created a situation where he is the only possible prime minister. Either the Blue and White Party or one of its three factions joins him, or Amir Peretz or Orly Levy bring the Labor Party in, or Israel goes to new elections. These are the only options. And according to reports in today's news, Benjamin Netanyahu has been selected to form the coalition government and has come to a certain level of agreement with Benny Gantz to join together with him to form a unity government. How that plays out will be determined over the next 28 days, and we will cover that here in our Revealing Prophecy segment. In other words, it's either going to be Netanyahu or elections. It's up to Gantz and Peretz. Moreover, the balance of power is still very much on the right. The right has 55 seats. The left has 44. Israel Beitenu leader Avigdor Lieberman, the man who induced Israel's political paralysis 10 months ago when he resigned his position as defense minister and maintained the stalemate in April when he refused to join a Netanyahu-led coalition and forced the country into a second Knesset election, is nothing but a Bibi hater. If he joined Gantz with his 8-seat faction, Gantz will still be short 9 seats. A coalition with Lieberman and the Arab parties is inconceivable because Lieberman's Russian voter base would abandon him if he were to go that route. Then, too, the Arab parties are so extreme that they cannot be considered for any governing coalition. This then brings us to the question of the Arab parties. This week, the Washington Post slandered Netanyahu and Israeli society. The editorial board falsely claimed that the public's aversion to including the Arab parties in a government is a product of racism. This is a lie. Israelis don't want to share power with the Arab parties because there's not one Arab party that accepts Israel's right to exist. There were Arab politicians elected yesterday or last week that have written odes to terrorist murderers on their Facebook pages. Arab lawmakers were elected that have met with terror kingpins. Arab lawmakers routinely support the Palestinian war against Israel and express support for Hamas. It is not racist for Israelis not to want Hamas supporters and champions of terrorist murders in the Israeli government or receiving security briefings from the military and intelligence services. It is rational. The deadlock in Israel is electoral, not ideological. Lieberman's defection from the right has denied it a governing majority. but it is still very much the majority in Israel. And the vast majority of Jewish lawmakers in the Knesset support applying Israeli law over the Jordan Valley, as Netanyahu suggested last week. A large majority, 55 to 44, of Jewish lawmakers also support applying Israeli law to other parts of Judea and Samaria. Netanyahu is the only person capable of forming a government. It remains to be seen if that will happen, but Benny Gantz cannot form a government. Over the next few weeks, he will come to terms with this unalterable reality, and then we will see what happens. Our next story: in face of growing Iran threat, debate resurfaces over U.S.-Israel Mutual Defense Pact. While the idea isn't new, it hasn't really been seriously discussed in a while. Proponents say that a narrow defense treaty would add a layer of deterrence to enemy aggression, but critics caution that it could undermine the relationship between the two democracies. A story contributed by Yaakov Lapin and Jackson Richmond. Although proposals for a U.S.-Israeli Mutual Defense Pact are not new, the concept has recently gained momentum and attracted growing media attention in Israel. On September 14th, U.S. President Donald Trump took to Twitter to say that he spoke with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu by phone to discuss the possibility of moving forward with a mutual defense treaty between the United States and Israel that would further anchor the tremendous alliance. Netanyahu, for his part, told Israeli media that he is looking forward to speaking with Trump at the UN General Assembly meeting, when we will promote the historical defense pact between the United States and Israel. Yet, Netanyahu's political opponents have criticized the idea, with senior Blue and White Party member and former Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Ya'alon telling Army Radio last week that if such a pact had existed in the past, the nuclear reactor in Syria would not have been bombed. Ya'alon was referring to the 2007 Israeli Air Force strike on the Bashar Assad regime's secret, undeclared plutonium reactor. Former Israel Defense Forces Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General retired Gabi Ashkenazi, also Blue and White, said, "We always insisted that the fate and security of the State of Israel remain in its own hands. Do we want to see the Golani Brigade fighting the Taliban in Afghanistan? That is the significance of the treaty." Yet those who have been involved in exploring and promoting the idea say they envision a significantly narrower pact. Speaking to JNS on September 11th, Michael Mikowski, President and CEO of the Jewish Institute for National Security of America, the JINSA, noted that his organization released a May 2018 report urging consideration of a mutual defense treaty that would be similar to, but more narrowly defined than the existing U.S. treaties with 50 countries around the world. The primary purpose of a U.S.-Israeli Mutual Defense Pact is to add an extra layer of deterrence to Israel's strategic position and to America's position in the Middle East, and ultimately a last line of defense, JINSA stated on its website. The organization is dedicated to educating congressional, military, and civilian national security decision makers on U.S. defense interests in the Middle East. This really originated with U.S. retired Navy Admiral Jim Stavridis, said Mikowski. Together with a JINSA task force made up of retired generals, Stavridis had been central in promoting the idea in recent years. The main motivator is the strategic threat. Israel always faced them, of course, but we worry that the Iranian threat is really growing, and the chances of a significant war have grown, explained Mikowski. Therefore, we think that a mutual defense pact would aid another layer of defense for Israel. Mitigation would be a second benefit, he added. Even if there is a significant conflict, a mutual defense pact could help mitigate the severity of the threat, not just from Iran, though obviously Iran is the main one. The Iranian threat is growing at the regional and nuclear levels. Mikowski said that while the idea is not new, it hasn't really been discussed seriously in a long time. The U.S. has a mutual defense with about 50 other countries. Mutual defense pact with the United States generally contribute to more stability. Should Israel and Iran enter a broad armed conflict, Tehran could be expected to activate its Lebanese proxy, Hezbollah, a non-state terror actor armed with some 130,000 rockets and missiles. A war on that scale would very likely impact American assets in the Middle East, said Mikowski. This would certainly spill over not only to Syria, but also to Iraq and perhaps to the Persian Gulf states. The U.S. would be affected by an Iranian-Israeli conflict. So we think a mutual defense pact could be an element that prevents such a conflict from starting out, and if it does start out, it could mitigate the scope and intensity of it. We actually see it as a source for stability, with which mutual defense pacts generally have been for countries around the world. Conflicts with smaller adversaries like Gazan terror groups would not, for example, activate such a treaty, and neither country would want to see that happen, he said, adding that only exceptional threats would activate it. Mikowski acknowledged concerns among some Israelis who have argued that such a pact would harm Israel's independent freedom of action. He said, "We don't want any restrictions on Israel's freedom of movement. We anticipate this to be a more limited defense pact. Our view is if Israel is going to do something very significant that could seriously impact U.S. assets in the region, we expect that Israel would be consulting with the U.S. on that anyway, given the close relations that they have. Without having a pact, there's already a sense of a need to consult on more serious action that Israel would consider. But we think that with a mutual defense pact, there at least would be a level of deterrence." He also stressed that the proposal has nothing to do with the Israeli elections, adding that work has been invested into developing the idea for the past year and a half. During a July 30th conference call organized by JINSA, Senator Lindsey Graham, Republican of South Carolina, affirmed that Israel intends to defend itself through their capabilities. Nothing in this agreement would suggest restricting the IDF's ability to do that. However, there are certain threats that Israel could face that would be existential to the Jewish state, and in those limited, narrow circumstances, we would want all adversaries of Israel to know that in your efforts to destroy them, you have to come through us. The proposal is meeting with its share of criticism on the American side as well. Elon Berman, Senior Vice President of the American Foreign Policy Council in Washington and an expert on regional security in the Middle East, Central Asia, and the Russian Federation, told JNS that calls for a formal defense pact have been a recurring theme in bilateral relations. The motivation on both sides is understandable. The U.S. wants to demonstrate its commitment to Israeli security, while the Israeli government is eager to capitalize on the pro-Israeli attitudes of the Trump administration. But it nevertheless is misguided and potentially dangerous to the health of bilateral ties, cautioned Berman. First, in defense terms, if an agreement is signed, America will naturally need to know what exactly it is committed to defending. That puts issues like the true status of Israel's nuclear program, about which the Israeli government remains coy, on the table for public discussion, said Berman. It will also force Israel to much more definitively articulate where it thinks its final borders vis-a-vis the Palestinians will be, since presumably U.S. troops will now be required to defend them in the event of a conflict. Given the importance of nuclear ambiguity to Israel's deterrent posture and the volatility of present-day relations with the Palestinians, Israeli officials shouldn't be eager to discuss either of those things. In addition, Berman said a defense pact carries with it the risk of aggravating anti-Israel sentiments within the United States. He noted a growing isolationist streak on the American political right in recent years, while the American left has, of late, tolerated anti-Israel and anti-Semitic sentiments from its progressive wing. Both factions are likely to react negatively to any further formalization of the U.S.-Israeli relationship, with conservatives seeing it as an unwelcome commitment that forces the United States to remain in a volatile Middle East, and liberals chafing at the perception that the United States is in some way beholden to Israel, noted Berman. At a time when the relationship between Israel and American Jewry is already under significant strain, this would be an added stressor and perhaps a significant one. Finally, he said, a formal defense pact would undermine the intrinsic nature of the special relationship, since the strength of U.S.-Israeli ties has always rested on their informal nature. The two countries are drawn together by common values, outlook, and strategic interests. Both Washington and Jerusalem need to continue to work diligently to reinforce this closeness, but they also need to be careful not to inadvertently take steps that alter the historical dynamism, fluidity, and adaptability that has made the relationship a success so far. Former Pentagon official Michael Rubin, a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, told JNS that the defense pact would absolutely tie Israel's hands and give America's slow and cautious defense bureaucracy a veto. He said that Israel would no longer be able to act proactively, nor could it act without implying a U.S. buy-in. Even if the pact were to be limited, Rubin said that in the age of proxy conflicts, it would never be cut and dried. Best to address the ambiguity without hands tied. Our next story takes us to U.S. sanctions, Central Bank of Iran going after suspected funding linked to terror groups. The United States has sanctioned the Central Bank of Iran, U.S. President Donald Trump told reporters at the White House on Friday, almost a week after the Islamic Republic attacked two Saudi Aramco facilities in which the president thus instructed the United States Department to substantially increase sanctions on the regime. The central bank has allegedly provided funding to Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps and its elite Quds force, in addition to Hezbollah, an Iranian proxy in Syria and Lebanon. Both the IRGC and Hezbollah are U.S. designated terrorist groups. Additionally, the Trump administration sanctioned the National Development Fund of Iran and Etemed Tejarte Pars Co. The NDF has allegedly been a major source of foreign currency and funding for the IRGC-QF and Iran's Ministry of Defense and Armed Forces Logistics, while Etemed Tejarte Pars is an Iran-based firm that has been used to hide financial transactions for the Ministry of Defense and Armed Forces Logistics military purchases, including funds originating from the National Defense Fund. Iran's brazen attacks against Saudi Arabia is unacceptable. Treasury's actions targets a crucial funding mechanism that the Iranian regime uses to support its terrorist network, including the Quds forces, Hezbollah, and other militants that spread terror and destabilize the region, says U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin. The United States will continue its maximum pressure campaign against Iran's repressive regime, which attempts to achieve its revolutionary agenda through regional aggression while squandering the country's oil proceeds. He continued, Iran's central bank and the National Development Fund were ostensibly intended to safeguard the welfare of the Iranian people, but have been used instead by this corrupt regime to move Iran's foreign currency reserves for terrorist proxies. We are putting governments on notice that they are risking the integrity of their financial systems by continuing to work with the Iranian regime's arm of terror finance, its central bank, said Sigal Mandelker, U.S. Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. A new president could try and lift the designation of the central bank to re-enter the JCPOA, but the market will remain hesitant to engage with the bank still financing terrorism, proliferation, etc. Market deterrence is the key driver, tweeted Mark Dubowitz, CEO of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, which has played such an influential role in influencing U.S. sanctions policies on Iran that it was recently threatened by the regime. While the reimposition of sanctions included U.S. sanctions on Iran's central bank, they were, through a legal mechanism, lifted under the 2015 accord as a nuclear sanction that a Democrat president could lift it again, were he or she elected next year, wrote Dubowitz in the Wall Street Journal in April. New central bank sanctions based solely on terrorism would be more difficult for a future president to remove, he wrote. The sanctions Trump just slapped on Iran are actually rather strenuous, Security Studies Group senior fellow Matt Brodsky told JNS. In the end, I'm not sure if it will change regime's behavior, and it may not be an effective substitute for an act of kinetic deterrence. There's still a forensic investigation into the recent attack in Saudi Arabia, and when that evidence is provided publicly, it may lead to more options to respond to Iran with more allies on board, he continued. So to sum it up, these are very biting sanctions applied today on Iran. Whether they lead to a change in Iran's malign activities is another matter. At least they'll have fewer resources to fund for those adventures in the meantime. Our next story is a question. Turkey seeks to go nuclear. Another trigger for Ezekiel 38. During the 17 years he has ruled NATO member Turkey, the country's Islamic strongman, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, has rarely missed an opportunity stealthily to convert Mustafa Kemal Atatürk's secular, pro-Western establishment into a rogue state hostile to Western interests. Erdogan now wants to make it a rogue state with nuclear weapons. They say we can't have nuclear-tipped missiles, though some have them. This I can't accept, Erdogan said in a September 4th speech, rejecting calls to prevent his country from acquiring nuclear weapons, while conveniently forgetting that Turkey has signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1980. In other words, Turkey's elected leader publicly declares that he intends to breach an international treaty signed by his country. Turkey is also a signatory to the 1996 Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which bans all nuclear destinations for any purpose. That is not, in fact, the first time Erdogan has voiced an eagerness to make Turkey a nuclear-armed state. As early as 2008, when he was the poster child of naive Western statesmen and intellectuals who believed he was a reformist Democrat, Erdogan said countries that oppose Iran's nuclear weapons should not have nuclear weapons themselves. Despite his use of the plural countries, Erdogan was apparently pointing his finger at the country he hates the most, Israel. In a 2010 speech, Erdogan described Israel as the principal threat to peace in the Middle East. In that speech, he repeated his skepticism about whether Iran intended to use its nuclear fuel program to build nuclear weapons, and said there was no such uncertainty concerning Israel's undeclared arsenal. If Turkey overtly or covertly launched a nuclear weapons program, as Erdogan apparently wishes, the move could well have a domino effect on the region. Turkey's regional adversaries would be alarmed, and Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Syria, and Greece might be tempted to launch their own nuclear weapons programs. Would Israel stand for a nuclear Turkey any more so than a nuclear Iran? Erdogan's threat to Israel have been more subtle than Iran's threats to wipe Israel off the map, but they are just as dangerous. In July, Turkey announced its plan to move forward with the purchase of a Russian S-400 air defense system. In response, the U.S. expelled Turkey from the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter program, canceling their previous orders of 100 F-35s. Furthermore, Turkey's announcement opened the door for more penalties under a 2017 act that calls for sanctions on any nation that buys a major defense article from Russia. Currently, relations remain strained as the two nations work to find a resolution. But far from an isolated incident, this is just the latest dispute between the United States and Turkey. The relationship between these two countries has been volatile for several years now. But this wasn't always the case. Up until a few years ago, Turkey was a reliable ally for the U.S., Israel, and NATO. Following World War I and the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk led a Turkish war of independence. When the war ended, the victors established the Republic of Turkey in 1923. Atatürk served as the new nation's first president. He oversaw numerous reforms to modernize Turkey. He established a secular Western democracy and made the nation a model democratic republic in the Middle East. In 1949, Turkey became the first Muslim nation to recognize Israel. In 1952, it joined NATO. For the latter part of the 20th century, Turkey was a strong ally of Israel. the U.S., and other Western nations. As the 21st century dawned, Turkey explored membership in the EU. This would have further solidified the nation's Western ties. Instead, an event took place that reshaped the future of Turkey. In 2003, Turkey elected Recep Tayyip Erdogan prime minister. A former member of a banned Islamic political party, Erdogan's administration has been hostile towards Turkey's secular and democratic institutions. Under Erdogan, Turkey has turned from its traditional Western allies and cultivated relationships with nations that oppose Western democracy. In July 2016, Erdogan cracked down on his political opponents following what he claimed was a coup attempt. He imprisoned thousands of citizens and consolidated his grip on power. A 2017 referendum further extended that power. Now the president, Erdogan, is the undisputed ruler of Turkey. The nation, once hailed as a model of freedom and democracy in the Muslim world, has quickly devolved into a totalitarian regime eager to befriend America's enemies. So why should you care? Aside from diminishing freedom and liberty for Turkey's citizens, these events have enormous prophetic significance. Why? Because Turkey is a key member of the Gog of Magog alliance. 6 centuries before the crucifixion of Jesus, Ezekiel foretold of a future invasion of Israel in Ezekiel 38 and 39. He said it will occur in the last days, Ezekiel 38:16. It will come from north of Israel, Ezekiel 38:15 and Ezekiel 39:2. And it will involve a coalition of nations led by Russia, Ezekiel 38:2. The nations Ezekiel cited were Russia, Magog, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Afghanistan, Persia, which is Iran, Kush, Sudan, Put, Libya, Meshach, Tubal, Gomer, and Beth Togarmah, equaling Turkey. For years, those who study Bible prophecy have wondered how Turkey fits into this alliance. After all, Turkey is a longtime ally of Israel. Also, as a member of NATO, the idea of Turkey rejoining a Russian invasion of Israel is hard for many to imagine. In 2014, the author Britt Gillette noted in his book, Signs of the Second Coming, Turkey is another interesting member of this military alliance. Since the restoration of Israel in 1948, those who understand Bible prophecy have struggled to figure out how Turkey fits in. Why? Because in 1949, Turkey became the first Muslim majority country to officially recognize the State of Israel. Turkey and Israel have a long history of diplomatic, economic, and military cooperation. Turkey is also a member of NATO. And what is the purpose of NATO? Its purpose is to defend member nations against Russian aggression. So why would Turkey join a Russian alliance to invade another country? While it hasn't made sense in recent years, that idea doesn't seem so far-fetched today. In May of 2010, Turkey and Russia signed a series of agreements enhancing their energy ties, including an agreement to build Turkey's first nuclear power plant. And in recent years, Turkey's domestic politics, historically secular in nature, have been heavily influenced by Islam. And that gives Turkey more than enough motive to join the Gog of Magog alliance. And here we are. Erdogan has consolidated power in Turkey. Atatürk's Turkey Republic is dead. The relationship between Vladimir Putin and Erdogan is strong and growing. All that's left to permanently move Turkey into Russia's sphere of influence is a clear break between Turkey and NATO. While we wait for that moment, the military forces of 3 most powerful members of the Gog of Magog alliance, Russia, Iran, and Turkey, are now cooperating in Syria. Just this week, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan hosted the leaders of Russia and Iran in Ankara for talks to resolving the Syrian civil war. It is expected any final agreement between these nations will put their joint military forces right on Israel's border. And not just any border, Israel's northern border. This is where Ezekiel said the invasion force will come from, north of Israel. Ezekiel 38:15, Ezekiel 39:2. Is this a mere coincidence? I don't think so. Never in history have these three nations formed an alliance. Now they're stationed directly to Israel's north. The stage is now set for the fulfillment of Ezekiel 38 and 39 prophecies. Turkey has made a strategic choice to align itself with Russia and Iran. Eventually, Russia, Iran, Turkey, and the other nations in the Gog of Magog alliance will send an overwhelming invasion force against Israel, Ezekiel 38, 8, and 9. When they do, God will destroy them and display his power and glory for all the nations to see, Ezekiel 38, 23. It's one more sign of how close we are to the second coming of Jesus. And that, my friends, is this week's edition of Revealing Prophecy. This program, along with Revealing the Bible, are only available after they air through the Biblical Truth Library. I want to encourage you to visit ignitingnation.com and sign up for our weekly newsletter and check out the Biblical Truth Library, which contains almost 1,000 hours of teaching with a Messianic rabbi. You can follow us online through Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you can catch up on over 1,400 interviews and never miss any of our great guests. Your comments and questions are always welcome, and we may include your answer in the next edition of the newsletter. Don't forget our regular live broadcasts are Monday through Friday from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. Central Time. Until we see you right back here tomorrow for the next edition of Revealing the Truth, we thank you for watching this edition of Revealing Prophecy and bid you Shalom.